A whisper from a canvas, a truth hidden in paint, and a portrait that spoke only after it was too late. In the hush between crimes, a new enigma stirs, one where brushstrokes reveal more than words, and silence may be the final confession. This isn't just a case of murder, it's a haunting riddle of art, memory, and manipulation. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a damp October morning in the year 1894 that I found my old companion unusually restless. Though the fire crackled cheerfully in the grate and the drizzle tapped with polite persistence upon the Baker Street windows, Sherlock Holmes stood unmoving, his back to the hearth and his eyes fixed upon a single letter laid unopened upon the mantelpiece. Written in green ink, on thick ivory paper, the letter had arrived the previous evening. For reasons known only to himself, Holmes had yet to break its seal. His silence, I noted, was not the silence of peace, but of calculation. It was precisely at 10:15 when the doorbell rang, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a boy no older than 12. He was pale, thin, and notably quick in his exit. Without a word, he handed Holmes a brown paper package no larger than a book, then vanished before Mrs. Hudson could inquire his name. Holmes, still not touching the green ink letter, studied the string with faint amusement. "Interesting," he murmured, setting the parcel beside the envelope. 2 missives in 2 days, both anonymous. One hesitates to open either, for fear of breaking the rhythm of an unseen performance. Hardly had Holmes returned to his place by the fire, when a knock, soft yet deliberate, sounded at the door. Into our sitting room stepped a man of striking singularity. He was tall, thin, and wrapped in a black artist's cloak that clung damply to his angular frame. His hair was flecked with grey, though he could not have been more than 40. The air about him carried turpentine, and his fingers were stained with what looked like charcoal dust. He glanced about the room with the distracted eyes of one accustomed to inner visions. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice tremulous, "I have come because my portrait has trapped me in a frame I cannot escape." Holmes did not rise, but offered a slight incline of the head. His gaze, sharp as a stiletto, passed over the man's cuffs, boots, and collar. "You came through the heath," he said. "The mud is distinctive, yet the smudge on your left cuff, charcoal, not paint. You sketch more often than you finish." The man blinked, as though unaccustomed to being observed with such precision. Yes, that's true. I tend to start again when a piece resists me." Holmes gave no sign of reaction. "Resistance in art, sir," he replied, "often mirrors resistance in the subject or the artist." The man's name, he said, was Aloysius Fernley. He was a portraitist of modest renown, once celebrated in Bloomsbury circles, but now withdrawn to Hampstead. He had come to us with a singular complaint, not of theft nor blackmail, but of a painting he could not finish. "She sat for me 5 times, he whispered, "Miss Violet March, and then she vanished." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Vanished!" "Without a word. Her family say she eloped, but I saw the terror in her eyes. She was afraid of someone." Holmes's fingers drummed once against the armrest. "Afraid," he repeated. "But of whom?" Holmes turned at last to the brown paper package, slicing the string with his penknife. Within lay a photograph, sepia-toned, faded. A young woman stared out with half-shadowed eyes. He studied it for several seconds, then glanced at Fernley. "You were right to come," he said, "but not for the reason you believe." I watched his face with unease. "Why, Holmes?" He turned the photograph slightly toward the light. "Because," he said softly, "there are eyes behind that frame, and they are not hers." I had painted society, women, colonels, and even an Austrian prince, Fernley began, clutching his gloves with nervous fingers. But none unsettled me like Miss Violet March. He paused. Holmes said nothing, his gaze fixed on the smudge of charcoal darkening Fernley's right thumb. She was introduced to me through a private patron of the arts and agreed to 5 sittings. Each one was punctual, polite, and curious. She asked many questions about my technique. I assumed it was a passing interest. I noticed that Fernley's tone grew tauter as he spoke, though he attempted composure. She had a striking presence, not classically beautiful, but captivating. Her expression held a kind of restrained sorrow. I confess, I found myself thinking about her long after each session ended. Holmes's fingers steepled under his chin. Then, in the 4th sitting, something shifted. She seemed distant, less present in the room, more troubled by something she would not name. She stared often toward the mirror behind her, as though fearing someone stood just beyond the glass. "And the 5th sitting?" I asked gently. She was quieter still. I was finishing the details of her mouth, and she flinched when my hand approached the canvas. "I realized it on the 3rd day," Fernley murmured, "that her smile had vanished." Holmes tilted his head slightly. She had been smiling in the earlier sittings. Subtly, yes, not a full smile. More a softness to her lips, a kindness. But that last session, it was gone. Her mouth tensed unnaturally, and she would not meet my eyes. She kept glancing, always, to the mirror behind her. He lapsed into a moment's silence, fingers twitching. She sat so still I thought at times she was no longer breathing. I told her we were near the end, that I would need only one more session. She nodded, but did not speak, and she said nothing at all about what troubled her. She said, "Some faces are never asked to keep, Mr. Fernley," and then she gathered her gloves and left. That was the last I saw of her. She was to return on Tuesday, Fernley continued, and I had prepared the final touches. The paint on her eyes had barely dried, but she did not arrive. He swallowed audibly. I waited the entire day, hoping for a telegram. I even sent a note to her residence. A week later, her brother responded, Julian March. He said his sister had gone abroad with a suitor from Vienna. A rather sudden departure, apparently. He thanked me for my time and assured me the commission was to be considered complete. Holmes's brow darkened, though he remained silent. I asked for forwarding details. None were provided. I inquired with the patron who introduced her. He had heard nothing. And her father, Osric March, replied with a single line. My daughter no longer requires artistic services. Fernley's hands trembled slightly. She left behind her silk scarf and her sketchbook. That sketchbook never left her side. You're certain? I asked. Positive. It contained her personal studies. She once said it was the only place she was honest. Holmes shifted slightly in his chair. A curious phrase, for a woman who sat so still. She may have been still, Fernley whispered, but she was not at peace. I went to the police, Fernley said, after a moment's hesitation. I spoke with a Sergeant Adley at the Hampstead Division. And what was their opinion? Holmes asked dryly. Fernley gave a joyless laugh. That I was suffering from artistic melancholy. They suggested a retreat to the seaside. Did they examine her belongings? They barely looked at them. I told them something was wrong, that Miss March had grown visibly distressed. But they pointed to my past, you see. Your past? I asked. Fernley's eyes met mine, weary and resentful. I suffered a breakdown 5 years ago. I was overworked. It was in all the papers. Since then, they view me as a romantic with an imagination too wild for facts. Ah, Holmes murmured. The imagination is tolerated until it contradicts the comfortable narrative. Exactly. And yet, Holmes added, you came here instead of painting over the canvas as you've done before. Fernley stiffened. Holmes rose then and approached Fernley with what seemed idle curiosity. He leaned close and tapped the man's right forefinger. Interesting, he said. Fernley blinked. Is something wrong? Not at all. I merely note that your smudges are dry, at least 2 hours old. You haven't worked since dawn. And yet, he added, plucking a folded paper from the man's inside coat pocket, you've carried this programme from last night's performance at the Lyceum. Fernley flushed, but said nothing. I presume you did not attend the play for leisure, Holmes continued. I suspect you were observing someone, perhaps the March family's movements. Fernley hesitated. I wanted to see if Julian March was in London. I thought I might glimpse him in their usual box. You saw him? I did. But he wasn't alone. Holmes returned to his chair. And what of your speech, Mr. Fernley? My speech? You stammer ever so slightly when mentioning Miss March, but not when speaking of the brother. The distinction is telling. Fernley's throat worked nervously. You're implying something I haven't said. No, Mr. Fernley, Holmes replied. I'm simply hearing the things you're trying not to. You were in love with her, Holmes said, without malice. Fernley looked away. I admired her, that is all. You admired the curve of her jaw, the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed into her lap. You noticed details a husband might miss, but a painter never would. It was not merely admiration. Fernley was silent. But you did not act upon it. Why? Because she was not mine to claim, because I believed, I hoped, that one day she would choose to remain. Holmes nodded. That is the trouble with portraiture, Mr. Fernley. It preserves what never truly belonged. The silence stretched. There is one detail you have not mentioned, Holmes added. Fernley's brow furrowed. And what is that? Holmes's voice dropped to a murmur. The last words she said to you. You've not repeated them. Fernley hesitated, then spoke softly. She said, he watches even when I close my eyes. Holmes rose and moved to the window, where the London fog drifted like ghostly paint across the panes. He lit his pipe and spoke with quiet finality. Mr. Fernley, I believe you. The painter blinked. You do? I believe Miss March did not leave of her own accord. I believe the painting you cannot finish contains more truth than you realise. And I believe someone wishes that truth to remain buried. Then you'll take the case. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. This is not a case about art. It is a case about control, over identity, over perception, and over silence. He tapped his fingers once against the mantel. And if I am right, he added, the answer is not in your canvas, but behind your mirror. We arrived at Fernley's studio in Hampstead on a bleak Thursday morning, the mist curling around the narrow garden gate like a thing alive. The studio itself was a modest annex behind a crumbling villa, its interior dim and heavy with the scent of linseed oil and turpentine. The air held the peculiar stillness of rooms that house more memories than conversation. Every surface bore the trace of unfinished labour. Canvases stacked like gravestones, studies half-sketched and abandoned mid-stroke, and paintbrushes stiff with disuse. Fernley unlocked the door with care, as if fearful of what we might find inside. He said little, merely gesturing toward the far end of the room. It was there that I saw the portrait. It stood alone on its easel, draped in shadow, yet unmistakably commanding. The woman it depicted, Miss Violette March, was seated in profile, her posture graceful, her hands resting in her lap. The eyes, however, defied repose. They seemed to follow us. Holmes said nothing. He moved slowly around the easel, his gloved hand hovering briefly over the canvas. At last, he turned to Fernley and said, "This is not a painting, sir. It is a question posed in oils." As Holmes examined the walls and corners with quiet calculation, my own attention was caught by something peculiar. The sketches. There were dozens of them, scattered across the tables, pinned to a board, even discarded on the floor. Each depicted Miss March, or rather, a part of her. Her eyes. In every sketch, Her gaze was averted, turned slightly to the side, never quite meeting the viewer. The lines were hurried, agitated, and dark. The repetition unnerved me. "These are all from life?" I asked Fernley. He nodded slowly. "I could not capture them. They changed too often. Some days she seemed alert and wary, others entirely withdrawn." Holmes glanced at me. "Or perhaps," he said, "what changed was not her expression, but who was watching her." The suggestion, though quietly spoken, chilled me more than the cold in the air. For indeed, the eyes on those pages seemed almost to plead. For what, I could not say. I moved closer to the portrait itself, examining the canvas with the awkward reverence of a man who knows little of art but feels much. The likeness was haunting. Miss March's cheekbones were softly lit, her hair gathered into a quiet elegance, her gown rendered with delicate precision. But the mouth, the mouth was wrong. It was blurred, not from poor technique but deliberately rubbed away. A faint trace of crimson remained, but the form beneath had been scrubbed, the pigment disrupted. "You altered it?" I asked Fernley. He did not answer immediately. "It wasn't right," he murmured. "It said too much." Holmes crouched to examine the base of the easel. "Or perhaps," he said, "it was what she said that troubled you." Fernley shook his head. "It was what she wouldn't say." To that, Holmes made no reply, but I saw his gaze drift toward the corner where a mirror stood, veiled in dust. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent on the journey back to Baker Street, but that evening, after a brief supper, he began to pace. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you know of Osric March?" I admitted I knew little beyond the name. Holmes, of course, had already rectified this omission. "A former naval officer turned industrialist," he recited, "wealthy, inflexible, and widely feared in both boardrooms and drawing rooms. A man, I dare say, who prefers obedience to affection." "And his daughter?" I asked. "Educated privately, never presented at court, and twice engaged. Both engagements mysteriously broken off. The first fiancé suffered a ruinous business failure shortly after announcing the match. The second emigrated to Canada under somewhat murky circumstances." Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling in thoughtful spirals. "Mr. Osric March," he continued, "has a history of eliminating what displeases him. And yet, he allowed Fernley to paint his daughter?" I frowned. Perhaps he didn't know. Or perhaps he knew and thought it harmless. A portrait, after all, is silent. I stared into the fire. Unless the portrait begins to speak. Holmes gave a rare smile. Then someone must silence it before others learn to listen. Julian March received us in a drawing room that was as precise and unwelcoming as the man himself. Tall, immaculately groomed, and dressed in a dark frock coat that seemed chosen for morning, he greeted Holmes with a practiced politeness that did not reach the eyes. "I do hope you haven't been brought into all this nonsense," he said with a clipped smile. "My sister's departure has clearly unsettled Mr. Fernley more than it ought." "She left for Vienna, I'm told," Holmes replied. "Yes, with her intended, a gentleman of good standing in the Austrian diplomatic corps. The arrangement came together very quickly." "And the gentleman's name?" Julian hesitated, just a breath too long. "Emil Strauss." Holmes offered no visible reaction. "Of the Viennese Strausses, I presume." "I couldn't say," Julian replied. "Curious. One would expect a brother to know the name of the man who has spirited his sister away." "She wished for discretion." Holmes inclined his head. "As does every ghost." Julian blinked. "Pardon?" "Nothing," Holmes said, already turning toward the door. "Only that the more polite a story sounds, the more likely it is to have teeth concealed beneath the lace." Fernley, having excused himself to fetch some earlier studies, left Holmes and me alone once more in the studio. I wandered idly, half listening to the soft creak of floorboards above, when Holmes called me over in a hushed tone. Behind the curtain that veiled the corner cabinet, he had discovered a shallow shelf. Upon it sat a single item, a leather-bound sketchbook, its spine worn and pages slightly curled at the edges. "Miss March's," he murmured, lifting it carefully. Within, the pages were filled with frantic lines, faces in shadow, symbols repeated like obsessive mantras, and the same figure drawn over and over, a man without eyes. I turned a page and stopped. Written in a small, delicate hand, between two sketches of her own profile, were the words, "He watches from behind the mirror." I looked up, chilled. "She knew," Holmes said quietly. "She feared she was being observed, not in the poetic sense, but literally." He closed the book and replaced it. "Fernley said she was afraid of someone. She was, but not of Fernley." "Then who?" Holmes turned toward the far wall, where the mirror still stood. "That," he said, "is precisely what I intend to find out." Returning to the portrait once more, Holmes drew his measuring tape from his coat pocket and began, to Fernley's confusion, to measure the shoulders and distance from chin to brow upon the canvas. I watched with some amusement. "Surely, Holmes, it is art, not architecture." "Indeed, Watson, but even art obeys proportions, especially when the artist works from life." He stepped back, hands folded. "Fernley, you are meticulous, are you not?" "I try to be," the painter replied warily. Holmes gestured. "Then explain why the length from clavicle to chin exceeds what would be anatomically correct by a full inch and a half." Fernley paled. "That's not possible." "Oh, it is. I checked the average measurements based on the society pages. Miss March was listed at 5'3". This figure suggests 5'5", and with broader shoulders." I felt my stomach twist. "You're saying that's not her?" Holmes said nothing at first. Then, "I'm saying, Watson, that either Fernley altered her proportions deliberately, which I doubt, or he painted what he saw, and what he saw does not match the official description." Fernley stared at the canvas in confusion. "Then who," he whispered, "was I painting?" Holmes's gaze did not leave the canvas. "That," he replied, "is the question we now must answer." Holmes stood before the painting longer than I had ever seen him linger over a piece of art. His arms were folded, his pipe unlit between his lips, and his eyes traced the lines of pigment as if reading a secret message in a dead language. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "There's a weight here, a tension in the underlayers." The mouth was painted and then removed. The eyes retouched, but not just corrected, concealed. I frowned. "Do you think Fernley painted over an earlier work?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "Not just possible, probable. I've seen it before. Painters reusing canvases, but this is different. The composition doesn't just hide an earlier image, it absorbs it." He stepped closer, running a finger along the lower right corner where a faint signature had been painted over. "There is another face beneath this one," he said. Fernley looked horrified. "You think I've copied her?" "No," Holmes said. "I think you've painted her twice." The silence that followed was deep and unsettled. At last, Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said, "I shall require a small scalpel, some linseed solvent, and no interruptions." And with that, he leaned in close and began to unmask the canvas, one whisper of paint at a time. Holmes worked with the precision of a surgeon and the silence of a priest. I had procured the necessary items, a scalpel from my medical kit and a small vial of solvent, and watched as he leaned close to the lower right edge of the portrait where the signature had been painted over. "There," he murmured, "you see the faint rise in texture, not damage, but layering. The paint beneath is older. It dries differently." With deft fingers, he moistened a corner and began to lift the top layer, scraping no deeper than a shaving of varnish. Bit by bit, the image began to shift. First it was the mouth, no longer erased, but a different shape altogether, fuller, more assertive. Then the jawline, harder and more angular. The eyes too seemed altered, still dark but set wider apart. "Good Lord," I whispered. "That isn't Miss March." "No," Holmes replied, unblinking. "But it is someone Fernley painted, and someone he wished to forget." He paused, tapping the edge of the palette knife against his palm. "This is no mere reuse of canvas. He didn't cover her out of thrift. He covered her out of necessity. To hide her, to bury her," Holmes said coldly. "Not with malice, but perhaps with guilt or fear." He stood, hands behind his back. "This is not the first unfinished portrait Fernley has abandoned, but I intend it to be the last one that remains unanswered." We sat in the hansom as it rattled southward, the wind scouring the windows. Holmes remained contemplative, his eyes narrowed as if the act of seeing alone could draw answers from the fog. "You've seen this before," I said finally. "Indeed," he replied. "Some artists rework canvases to chase perfection. Fernley reworks them to erase what cannot be explained." "You believe this has happened before?" "I suspect so, and not merely as artistic indecision. This pattern, the unfinished canvas, the sitter who disappears, the silence that follows, it reeks of ritual." He tapped his fingers once against his knee. "If Fernley were a villain, the matter would be simple. But I believe he is a participant, not an architect. Someone else rewrites his truth. He merely applies the brush." I stared at him. "Then what of the woman beneath the paint?" Holmes looked out at the grey London streets. "She was real once, and someone feared what she saw, just as Miss March feared the mirror." The cab turned down a quiet lane in Bloomsbury. "You're going to the source?" I asked. "To the man who framed Fernley's last scandal," Holmes said, stepping out. "Because if truth hides behind paint, it must also be held within wood and brass." The shop smelled of dust and old varnish, of things left to dry and never reclaimed. It was narrow, cluttered and half in shadow. A bell tinkled as we entered, and from the rear emerged a stooped man with an apron stained by decades of pigments. He peered at Holmes over spectacles thick as fog. "You'll not be here for your usual size, Mr. Holmes. What brings you down to a forgotten trade?" "Memories," Holmes said, "of the sort buried in wood." The man gave a tired chuckle. "Then you're after ghosts. Most of my work is done for them these days." Holmes gestured for me to speak. I stepped forward. "We're looking into a portrait, never delivered, 5 years past. A young woman, painted by Aloysius Fernley." The framemaker's hands slowed. "You've seen one then?" "We've seen more than one." He moved behind the counter, produced an old ledger and flipped with careful fingers. There was one he never collected. Woman with pearls and a dark velvet bodice. Paid in full by a man named, Rufus March. I felt Holmes stiffen beside me. The old man looked up. "They never picked it up. Said the girl had gone abroad. But I heard whispers. Her name was Clara Henslow." "And what became of her?" I asked. He looked down. "No one knows. But Fernley never painted with colour again. That was the last portrait he finished, until this one." Holmes remained quiet as we walked back into the street, the fog clinging to his coat like a second skin. When he finally spoke, it was as if the words had been fermenting all along. "Rufus March," he said, "a solicitor, discreetly paid, and brother to Osric March. A man whose name vanishes neatly from every record, except the private ledgers of craftsmen too old to lie." "And Clara Henslow?" I asked. "An artist's model, likely hired through a third party, painted, paid for, then erased." We stopped at a lamppost where Holmes lit a match and stared at the flame. Violet March must have discovered something. Perhaps the sketchbook contained more than drawings. Perhaps she recognised the face Fernley thought lost beneath the paint. "And the hush money?" Holmes exhaled a long breath. "Standard practice for scandal. The March family controls not only its fortune, but its narrative." I looked up at him. "You think they would kill to preserve it?" Holmes didn't answer. He dropped the match and crushed it under his heel. "We must go back," he said at last. "To Fernley's studio?" "No, to the mirror." We returned to Fernley's studio just past dusk, under the pretense of Holmes wishing to compare lighting conditions from the earlier visit. Fernley, though pale and withdrawn, offered no protest and resumed work at a separate canvas while Holmes and I drifted about in silence. Holmes's interest, however, was no longer in the portrait, but the mirror. He stood before it, eyes narrowed. "Aesthetically unsuitable," he muttered. "Placed behind the sitter, it reflects neither painter nor subject, yet Fernley says she always glanced toward it." He reached for a ruler and traced the outline where the mirror met its wooden frame. "Observe this," he said softly. "The right edge is warped, subtly bowed." "To the naked eye, it seems perfect," I replied. "Exactly, which is what makes it suspicious." He tapped gently, moving from edge to edge. The left side rang hollow, the right side duller, dead. He retrieved a narrow blade from his coat pocket and slid it into the seam at the base. After a moment's work, a section of the frame detached with a faint click. Behind it lay a shallow cavity, its edges worn by repeated handling. Holmes reached in and withdrew a velvet pouch containing a brass key and a coil of wire, ordinary things, yet oddly out of place. He turned to me. "Someone stood behind this mirror, Watson. Someone who wanted to see and not be seen." Holmes examined the panel's interior with delicate precision. His fingers paused near a cluster of darkened brass. With a slight twist, a wooden flap gave way and revealed a narrow peephole, bored at an angle directly toward the easel. I peered in. What I saw sent a shiver through me. The view was intimate, almost intrusive. Positioned at eye level with the subject's chair, every facial expression, every flicker of discomfort or hesitation would have been visible to the watcher behind the glass. "Good heavens," I muttered. They weren't imagining it, either of them. "No," Holmes said flatly. Miss March's fear was entirely rational. She was being watched. He gestured toward the mirror's edge. "The angle is precise. This was not clumsily retrofitted. It was designed this way, engineered to pass unnoticed." "Fernley never knew." Holmes gave a wry smile. "The artistic temperament can be selectively blind, Watson. He might have suspected. But what man wishes to believe his sanctuary has been turned into a theatre box for someone else's performance?" He replaced the flap and stepped back, eyes thoughtful. "We are not merely dealing with a disappearance. We are dealing with theatre, played for a hidden audience. And that audience knew when to lower the curtain." That evening, Holmes paced before the fire with a restlessness that signalled something deeper than deduction. "You have been unusually silent," I ventured. He paused, then said, "Watson, tell me, what is madness?" I blinked. "Surely you are not asking a medical man for philosophical definitions." "I am asking," he said, "because we must decide if Fernley is a victim of his own fractured mind, or a man whose very fracture has been exploited." He tapped the mirror key against his palm. "Consider, a young woman vanishes under circumstances nearly identical to a case 5 years prior. The common element? Fernley. And yet, what links both is not his hand, but his eye." "You think someone manipulated him?" I asked. Holmes gave a grim nod. "Repeated trauma, layered guilt, and a carefully curated environment. Fernley was allowed to create, but only what they wanted him to see." "But why use him at all?" "Because he paints what he sees. He is incapable of invention, and that, Watson, makes him the most dangerous witness of all." He threw the key onto the mantel. "If Fernley is a puppet, we must find the hand. If he is the hand, then we must ask whose face he has painted. Twice." Holmes rose early the next morning and began issuing instructions with a briskness that admitted no debate. Telegrams were sent, notes were dispatched, and I found myself dispatched to Scotland Yard with a sealed envelope and strict orders to speak only with Inspector Gregson. When I returned, Holmes was already dressed in a charcoal suit and carried an ornate walking stick I had never seen before. "I trust you haven't revealed too much?" he asked. "I gave Gregson the note as you requested." He raised an eyebrow but said little. "Excellent. That gives us precisely 6 hours." "6 hours for what?" "For a sitting," he said. "A what?" "I've arranged for Mr. Fernley to paint a new subject," Holmes said coolly. "He believes it to be a commission from a collector of eccentric tastes, a stranger, an enigma." "You?" He allowed himself the faintest smirk. "An eccentric stranger in need of a portrait, with rather specific requirements of lighting and mirror positioning." I stared. "And the trap?" Holmes retrieved a small vial of clear oil and placed it into his breast pocket. "The mirror has eyes, Watson, but this time, so do we." And without another word, he departed for Hampstead, leaving only the scent of pipe smoke and orchestration behind him. It would be difficult to overstate the transformative power of Sherlock Holmes when in disguise. I have seen him as a groom, a sailor, a clergyman, and once, memorably, as an opium addict in Limehouse. But never had I seen him play the part of a patron of the arts with quite so much relish. That morning, he became Mr. Horatio Wetherall of Belgravia, a reputed collector of eccentric modern portraiture, and an admirer of Fernley's uncompromising psychological realism. He arrived at the Hampstead studio with a cane of exotic wood, a monocle he refused to use, and an attitude that mixed condescension with effusive praise. Fernley, caught between suspicion and flattery, accepted the commission with visible uncertainty. "I seldom take new patrons," he murmured. "My last sitting was complicated." "Precisely why I seek your hand, Mr. Fernley," Holmes replied with a benevolent smile. "I desire complication, not flattery, not prettiness, truth." As Fernley prepared his palette, Holmes casually walked to the window and adjusted the blinds, changing the lighting angle. Then he suggested, most insistently, that the mirror be angled slightly more toward the easel, so I might see myself as you see me. Fernley acquiesced without question, and so the trap was set, not with violence or bait, but with a mirror and a canvas. The stage was prepared, and somewhere behind the glass, a shadow was waiting. While Holmes played his role upon the stage of Fernley's studio, I undertook the quieter half of our strategy. Disguised not with costume, but with courtesy, I presented myself at the March estate as Dr. John Watson, late of Queen's Medical, on a follow-up call regarding a fainting spell Lady March had experienced the previous spring. It was an old trick, but one rendered effective by the English gentry's preference for good breeding over verification. I was ushered in by a grim-faced housekeeper, and, after offering vague murmurs of concern and asking for tea, left momentarily to await the lady's arrival. That moment was all I needed. I made for the west staircase, but it was watched, so instead I turned east, where no one had dusted in weeks. The corridor was lined with faded portraits and a set of shuttered windows that had not been opened in years. The trail was quiet, but not cold. Along the way, I noted a missing space on the wall where a picture frame had once hung, and beside it, a worn strip of wallpaper just tall enough to mark the passage of a child's growth. This wing had been lived in, and then abandoned. A spider's web stretched from one doorknob to another. I snapped it gently and reached for the nearest latch, but it did not open. A locked door in an unlocked wing is never innocent, and Holmes had taught me long ago. When a door is sealed, someone fears what lies behind it. The key was not on my person, nor on the nearest hook by the stair rail, but the houses of the wealthy are rarely built with the expectation of secrets staying secret. I crouched beside the door, ran my hand along the wainscoting, and soon discovered what I hoped, a slender catch, half concealed beneath a loose section of carved wood. With a soft click, the panel gave way, revealing a small recess and an iron key, old but polished from use. The door opened with a hesitant groan. Inside, the air was dry but close, as though the room had not breathed in years. Dust coated the surfaces, but not thickly. Books had been shifted. A wardrobe door hung slightly ajar. The scent was not of decay, but of something far subtler: camphor, aged fabric and lavender. It was a bedroom, small, feminine, and intimate. A girl's chamber grown into a woman's, then abruptly frozen in place. On the dressing table sat a silver brush, engraved with the initials VM. A single glove lay beside it, stitched with delicate flowers. Above the bed, faded wallpaper had been covered by newspaper clippings, society columns mostly, detailing the March family's engagements, galas, and philanthropy. But one article had been underlined, in red pencil: heiress declines public debut for reasons undisclosed. I looked again at the bed. It had been slept in recently. A fresh indentation, still slightly formed. Violette March had not vanished to Vienna. She had been here, perhaps still was, and someone had gone to great lengths to pretend otherwise. I began with the bookcase, an old cherrywood cabinet with uneven shelving and a faint ridge of dust along its top edge. Several books were pressed tightly together, but one volume, an illustrated guide to Renaissance portraiture, tilted forward slightly, as though often handled. I pulled it free. Behind it, a hollow. Inside the cavity was a thin leather notebook, its edges worn, its clasp broken. Violette's diary. I opened it with a trembling hand. Her script was graceful, precise. Each page lined with observations, memories, and at times, peculiar fragments that hinted at something darker. I sat for him again today. He says he sees me more clearly each time, but I feel myself vanishing. Julian brought me another letter. He says father still disapproves, yet they smile in public. There's a noise in the studio when he's not there. The mirror creaks when no one touches it. As I turned to the final pages, her entries grew more erratic. Her writing slanted upward, words crossed out and replaced with trembling alternatives. Then the last entry. He is not me. He wears my voice. He smiles when I cry, and they all pretend not to hear it. Beneath it, in red ink, only one line. I am still here. I closed the diary. If Holmes had set a trap in Hampstead, then I had stumbled into a mausoleum disguised as a home. And if we did not act swiftly, Violette March's voice, like her portrait, might vanish forever behind a mirror. By the time I returned to the studio, Holmes had already begun the sitting. Fernley was entirely absorbed in his work, his brush moving in short, deliberate strokes across the canvas. Holmes, now in full character as the enigmatic Mr. Weatherall, sat perfectly still but held the pose of a man who expected to be studied, not admired. I said nothing as I entered, but Holmes gave the faintest twitch of his eyebrow, the only sign he had registered me at all. Then mid-pose, he rose slightly and crossed the studio. "Forgive me, Mr. Fernley," he said, "but the light seems to have shifted." Without awaiting permission, he adjusted the blinds a fraction, then stepped to the mirror and angled it more steeply so that it caught the studio door, and more importantly, the hidden compartment behind it. Fernley glanced up, distracted. It may distort the composition. Holmes smiled. Sometimes distortion is exactly what's needed to reveal the subject. He returned to his seat, and behind the mirror, though no sound was made, I had the distinct sensation that something had moved. The trap was no longer waiting to be sprung. It was tightening. The light shifted again, only subtly, but Holmes tilted his chin as if registering some imagined discomfort. Fernley, oblivious to the artifice, was lost in the rapture of his own brushwork. His gaze moved constantly between canvas and sitter, but never once behind him. Holmes, meanwhile, maintained his pose with an air of aristocratic distraction. I stood silent at the back of the room, near enough to see the mirror's newly adjusted surface, and what it now revealed. There, behind the wall that framed Fernley's favoured angle of observation, a panel slid open with almost inaudible precision. A man emerged. He was slight of frame, but dressed with studied elegance. The silver-streaked hair, the finely shaped hands, the quick darting glance as he crossed the hidden vestibule, all unmistakable. Julian March. He did not see us, nor the mirror, his eyes fixed only on the bookcase beyond, as if searching for something long denied him. But in the mirror, his figure stood clear, not ghostly, not suggested, clear. And in that reflection, he hovered as though summoned by a magician's sleight of hand. His entrance had been silent, his presence was not. Holmes gave no signal. He did not need to, for Fernley's next glance at the mirror was prolonged, as if the glass no longer behaved as it had before, and in the span of a heartbeat, the painter's grip faltered. The spell had cracked. The sound that followed was sharp and final, the wooden clatter of Fernley's brush striking the floor. His shoulders stiffened, his breath catching like a man plunged into icy water. He stood as if his spine had fused, staring not at Holmes, nor at me, but at the mirror. "What is this?" he croaked. Behind him, Julian March remained still, sensing too late that he had entered a room not quite as secret as he had believed. Fernley turned slowly, his face pale with a strange, almost religious dread. No, you're dead. They said you were dead." Julian stepped forward, cautious. "Fernley." "You're the one she feared," Fernley whispered. "She didn't say it, but it was you." The air was thick with disbelief, and for a long moment none of us moved. Holmes had not shifted in his chair, yet I could see the calculation behind his stillness, every muscle alert, every breath measured. Fernley's hands trembled at his sides. Holmes finally spoke, gently, almost conversationally. "The past, Mr. Fernley," he said, "has a most unfortunate habit of looking back." Julian took a step backward, then another. His eyes flicked toward the corridor, but Holmes rose with the slow grace of a man wholly unconcerned by flight. "You might find escape more difficult than anticipated, Mr. March," he said. "The housekeeper has instructions, and the front door is no longer your ally." Julian hesitated. "You have no authority." Holmes raised a hand, silencing him. "I have reason," he said, "and I have something rather more persuasive than authority." He walked to the easel, then knelt beside it and tapped twice upon the floorboards beneath. The sound was peculiar, wood striking hollow wood. With a flick of his fingers, he pressed a knot in the panel. A soft click sounded, and a narrow section of the flooring lifted. From within came the unmistakable scent of decay. Wrapped in canvas, bound with coarse twine, were the skeletal remains of a young woman, long hidden, perfectly entombed. I staggered back involuntarily. Fernley let out a strangled cry and collapsed against the wall, eyes fixed not on the corpse, but on the portrait he had left unfinished. Julian said nothing. Holmes stood. "There is artistry in concealment," he said coldly. "But even a masterpiece betrays the hand that painted it." Scotland Yard arrived 12 minutes later, Lestrade among them, flushed with anticipation. Holmes, of course, had telegraphed them before ever donning his disguise. Julian March did not resist. He bowed his head as the constables took him by the arms, as though accepting the end of a long performance. Fernley sat, slumped in his chair, eyes glazed, fingers twitching against his paint-stained trousers. Lestrade muttered something about insanity and motive, but Holmes ignored him. It was Fernley who broke the silence. "I only ever painted what I saw," he murmured. "She was never still. The mirror trembled when she sat." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. "Truth," he said, "has a curious relationship with art. Sometimes it speaks loudest through silence, and sometimes its scratches from behind the glass. As the body was lifted from the floor and the constables gathered the last of the evidence, I felt a weight settle over the studio. Not horror exactly, but something deeper. The mirror remained angled toward the easel, and in it, faintly, the face of Violette March stared back, not from the glass, but from the canvas, unfinished, but now, finally, seen. It was 2 days later when Holmes, once more in his dressing gown and slippered feet, began to speak, not idly, but with that deliberate cadence which meant he was preparing to strike the heart of the matter. "You recall, Watson," he said, staring into the fireplace, "that Miss March's letters made mention of certain inconsistencies in her uncle's stewardship of the estate." "I do," I replied, setting aside my newspaper. "Julian March," Holmes continued, "was not merely eccentric, he was desperate. Violette had begun to question the absence of funds she knew had once existed, the sale of ancestral land, the vanished accounts. Too many shadows where there should have been figures. And she confronted him? She did not need to. She simply began asking questions. The kind that corner a man who has been juggling ghosts." Holmes tapped the end of his pipe against the mantel. He had no child, no heir. But if Violette were to denounce him before the Board of Trustees, he would be ruined, I said. Precisely, and worse, he would lose the very legacy he had manipulated into his hands. She, by birth and scrutiny, had become an obstacle. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the revelation slowly settling. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "It was not madness, Watson, nor impulse. It was strategy, old and cold, calculated, executed," he paused, "and hidden behind the charming disorder of an artist's brush. You recall Fernley's visit to us," Holmes said. "His unease, his trembling hands, those were not simply signs of guilt. They were signs of torment." I nodded. He seemed genuinely disturbed. Indeed, because he was a man already broken. His episode of collapse some years ago, when he was institutionalized briefly, left a scar upon his mind. A permanent fissure, just wide enough for someone else's influence to seep through. Holmes picked up the discarded palette knife that still bore traces of pigment from the studio. Fernley believed himself to be in control, but Julian's manipulation was masterful. He preyed on the painter's thirst for realism, his obsessive compulsion to see truly. "He was used?" I asked. "Utterly." Julian introduced him to the studio, offered him the commission under the guise of artistic legacy. He encouraged the mirror, knowing its effects. He fostered delusion with compliments, praise, and eventually guilt. Holmes's voice dropped. He made Fernley believe that it was he who frightened the girl. But Fernley never laid a finger on her? No, but the mirror did. The mirror twisted her reflection, haunted her from within the frame, and Julian stood behind it, whispering truths darkened into horror. A silence lingered between us. Fernley, Holmes said, was not an accomplice. He was the final tool, and like any brush, he left traces. He glanced at the knife again. In colour, in line, and in silence. The mirror, Holmes began, pouring himself a modest brandy, was not merely decorative. I leaned forward. Then it was intentional. Oh, very. Its placement was architectural, not aesthetic. Hidden behind the panelling, positioned to reflect only from a particular vantage. Fernley's chair. He gestured toward the chalkboard he had marked with quick sketches and measurements. A narrow slit in the wall, on the other side, a concealed corridor, formerly used for maintenance in the house's older days. Julian repurposed it. For what? Holmes sipped the brandy. For surveillance, control, manipulation. He tapped the chalk mark where the corridor aligned with the canvas. Fernley believed he was painting from life, but he was painting under influence. Julian could observe not only the sitter, but Fernley himself. He could appear in glimpses, distort shadow and shape, create the illusion of movement or presence. I felt a chill despite the warm room. Miss March, seated before that mirror, caught more than her reflection. She caught his reflection, or so she thought, and her fear became imprinted in her posture. Her eyes, Holmes added, almost absently, "It is not difficult, Watson, to drive a woman to silence. All it takes is the right room, the right mirror, and a man who knows where to stand." He set the glass down. Truth may lie beneath oil and pigment, but deception often begins with glass. Holmes drew the unfinished portrait closer, laying it upon the table with something resembling reverence. "Now look, Watson, not at what is painted, but at how." I peered at the canvas, recalling Fernley's frenzied insistence that he had merely captured what was there. "Start with the shoulders," Holmes said. "Notice how the left slopes unnaturally downward while the right lifts as though braced. Yet the spine, if you follow the dress seam, remains perfectly vertical." "Odd," I murmured. "Not odd, impossible, unless the subject were leaning dramatically to one side, which Miss March was not." I asked the housemaid. She posed rigidly from anxiety. He took up a charcoal stub from his desk and sketched a triangle around the head and shoulders. "Now observe the light. You see the shadow beneath the jaw suggests a downward source, but there is none in the studio. Fernley painted what he felt, not what he saw. And the eyes," I added, "they do not meet the viewer." Holmes smiled. "Indeed, they look toward the left edge, toward the mirror's frame." And yet Fernley swore he never adjusted her pose. He turned the canvas gently. "The true marvel is here, in the undersketch." Beneath the final strokes, faint but visible, was a discarded composition, one in which the arms were crossed and the figure leaned backward. "She changed her pose mid-session," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "She flinched, and Fernley unconsciously followed." He tapped the canvas once more. "This portrait, Watson, is not a likeness. It is a confession, not hers, his." And as I looked again, I saw what Holmes saw. Not Violet March, but the ghost of someone watching her, etched in absence. The final thread came from an address Holmes had scribbled days prior, but not yet summoned. It belonged to a quiet man named Lyle, a frame maker who had crafted the gilded enclosure for Fernley's ill-fated painting. He spoke in hushed tones, awed by the notoriety of recent events. "Yes, sir," he said, polishing a beveled edge. "Mr. Fernley sent the measurements, but it was the man who paid that I recall." "What man?" Holmes asked. "Not the artist. Older gentleman, tall, stooped, with a limp. Said the frame was to match one he'd once seen in Paris. Rococo flourishes, shallow curve, suitable for—" What did he say? Ah, for hiding one's intentions. And his name? Rufus March. I felt a jolt. "But Julian—" Holmes raised a hand. Rufus was his middle name. He turned to me with that quiet gleam I had come to know. "It is a curious habit among the guilt-laden, Watson, to sign only what they believe cannot be traced." The frame-maker tilted his head. "Did I say something?" "You did, Mr. Lyle," Holmes said. "You spoke with the elegance of a judge." As we stepped outside, Holmes lit a cigarette. "It is always the frame, Watson. One cannot hang deceit without it." I could not help but smile, and yet, beneath it, I felt the sadness of a girl who had once sat still, while shadows moved behind the glass. It was not until we were back in Baker Street, the portrait leaned against the hearth, that Holmes acted upon a suspicion which had quietly germinated from the moment he saw Fernley's trembling hands. With the cool deliberation of a man slicing through illusion, he took up a fine palette knife and began to lift, ever so gently, the uppermost layer of paint from the canvas's lower right corner. "You'll ruin it," I protested, half from horror and half from habit. Holmes offered only a mild glance. "It is already ruined, my dear Watson, ruined by falsehood. I seek the original. What emerged, slowly and with a gasp from both of us, was a ghost beneath the painting, a different figure entirely, not Violet March, but a blurred woman in mourning black, painted with the same posture, the same withdrawn eyes, and the same faint turn of the shoulder. The brushwork was unmistakable. His mother, Holmes said softly. The woman he painted before his mind broke the first time. I said nothing. Fernley is a man caught in recurrence, Holmes continued. This compositions, he has painted it before, always with different names, different models, but the same sorrow. And Julian March recognized the pattern and used it. He gave Fernley the conditions to repeat it, and thereby believed the madness would do his silencing for him. Holmes stepped back. But madness does not lie. It may distort, but it does not deceive with purpose. Only the sane can plot. As we sat in silence that evening, the ticking of the clock mingled with the faint scent of turpentine rising from the scraped canvas. There is a cruelty and irony, I said at last. The man who devoted his life to painting only what was true was used to uphold a lie. Holmes did not respond immediately. He was focused on a faint signature emerging beneath the old paint. Not Fernley's name, but a symbol he had used before, an unfinished letter F, always abandoned, never complete. Fernley, Holmes murmured, believed that by painting what he saw, he could control what he feared, but the mirror confused him. It gave him not truth, but suggestion. And he never questioned it. Would you, Watson? Holmes asked mildly. If all your life you had feared your perception could betray you, would you not cling to what you believed was evidence of certainty? I said nothing. He was manipulated because he was honest, and therein lies the bitterest tragedy. I could not shake the feeling that Fernley had been not only deceived, but broken anew. A man with eyes for beauty, and hands forced to repeat a ghost. The case, by formal measure, was closed. Julian March would face trial. The inheritance dispute would fall to civil courts. Scotland Yard, with suitable pomposity, claimed prompt resolution. But Holmes, I observed, took little satisfaction from the matter. Fernley, he said, once all had left our sitting room, was not a criminal. He was not even, strictly speaking, sane. And yet I find myself more moved by him than by the victim. That is unusually compassionate of you, I noted. He smiled faintly. Compassion, Watson, is simply the logical response to undeserved suffering. Fernley painted what haunted him, and he was punished for the haunting. He stood and examined the half-scraped portrait once more. There are faces, he said quietly, we never finish, because to finish them would be to acknowledge them, and some truths, especially those imposed upon us, must remain forever incomplete. I found his words strangely moving. Will Fernley paint again? I asked. Holmes shrugged. He may, but he will never again believe the canvas. That trust has been severed. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's chimed the quarter hour. I made a final note in my journal that night, not of the culprit, nor of the clever deduction, but of the frame, because it was not the brush that told the greatest lie. It was the edges that defined the lie's shape, and somewhere, perhaps, Fernley still paints, but never quite to the edge. In the days following Julian March's arrest, the portrait of Violet remained propped in the corner of our sitting room, facing slightly away from the light, as though unwilling to be fully seen. I found myself staring at it more than was logical, unable to reconcile the woman's painted serenity with the ugliness that had befallen her. There is something dreadfully ironic in it, I reflected, that a canvas, mute and immobile, should speak the truth only once the voice of its subject had been forever stilled. The brush had caught what the eye could not, the strained posture, the quiet despair, the shadow no one acknowledged. She told her truth, Holmes, I murmured one evening. But no one heard her until it was too late. Holmes did not look up from his chair. Perhaps, Watson, he said, but the canvas was listening, and that is more than most can say. It was during one such contemplative silence that an absurd notion occurred to me. Holmes, I asked, have you ever taken up a brush yourself, painted, or, heaven forbid, sat for a portrait? He glanced up, one brow slightly raised in amusement. You presume, Watson, that I sit still long enough for either endeavour. You are an admirer of detail, I insisted. I should think painting might appeal to your precise temperament. On the contrary, he said, stretching his long legs. The painter's impulse is to capture. Mine is to uncover. One preserves illusion, the other strips it away. Opposing trades. And yet, I said, gesturing to the portrait, you've just solved a murder with paint as your evidence. Holmes allowed himself the briefest smile. I do not object to paint, Watson. I object to sentiment disguised as permanence. I chuckled, uncertain whether I had been rebuffed, corrected, or simply outpaced in conversation. Holmes tapped the bowl of his pipe against the grate and leaned back, his gaze drifting once again to the painting. A face may lie, Watson, he said at length, but brushstrokes seldom do. I turned in my chair. You believe this portrait to be more honest than the woman herself? Not more honest, merely less self-conscious. The painter's hand reveals what the sitter dare not confess. But in this case, I countered, Fernley distorted reality. He was manipulated. Indeed, but even manipulated hands twitch in protest. That shoulder, angled unnaturally, that light falling where no sun could reach. These are not accidents, Watson. They are symptoms. A trembling conscience leaves fingerprints in composition. And yet the law would never notice such things. Which is why, Holmes said dryly, the law paints in black and white, whereas I prefer the infinite shades between. He exhaled a long, curling plume of smoke that seemed, in that moment, oddly wistful. The morning post arrived with its usual rattle and thump. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps receded before Holmes stirred from his seat. He gathered the letters with an idle hand, his eyes scanning them with the same detached curiosity one might grant a gallery wall. A bill, an invitation, and a request for authentication of a disputed signature, he murmured. Which shall you attend to first? I asked. He tapped the last envelope. Forgery, of course, always a promising start. There was a pause. Besides, he added, it appears to come from the Vatican archives. I blinked. That'll be diverting. Holmes settled back into his armchair, pipe freshly packed, the faint aroma of latakia beginning to drift once more through the room. The light outside had softened, and for a moment the flat felt suspended between the last case and whatever waited just beyond the threshold. You know, Watson, he said, some tales never properly end. They simply linger, unfinished, like Fernley's canvases. I nodded, watching the last curl of smoke rise toward the ceiling. And you prefer it that way? Finality, Holmes said, is a myth peddled by fiction writers and magistrates. In truth, most crimes leave threads. A clever man keeps his needle sharp. He reached for the letter opener and slit the Vatican envelope with an almost boyish anticipation. Well then, he said, scanning the first line, I believe we have time for another unfinished tale. And with that, the game, quietly and without fanfare, began again. As we sat once more in our familiar sitting room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the carpet, I could not help but glance at Holmes as he tapped the ashes from his pipe and leaned back with a look of peculiar stillness. It is curious, Watson, he said at last, how often the truth lies not in what is seen, but in what one is permitted to see. In this affair, a mirror did not reflect reality. It distorted it to serve a purpose. And yet, in that very distortion, the truth was preserved, waiting for the right observer. He turned to me with the faintest smile. Deception is an art, but like all art, it eventually reveals more of the artist than the subject. What do you think was the criminal's greatest oversight? Was it trusting the mirror, underestimating Fernley, or something far subtler? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories. And if you enjoy unravelling mysteries with Holmes and me, do subscribe for more adventures and pass this story along to a fellow sleuth. The game, as always, is far from over.